We were in the jungle.
On était au jungle.
There were too many of us.
Et on était de trop dans l'équipe.
We had access to too much money.
On avait accès à trop d'argent.
Too much equipment.
Trop d'équipement.
And little by little we went insane.
Hello and welcome once again to the Cine-Files. My name is Steve Morris. I'm a filmmaker and directing instructor in Los Angeles, California.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Roque. I'm a writer, producer, and host over there on the Outlaw Nation, and voiceover guy as well, and massive fan of the gentleman we are talking about today. I call him FFC for short, but he is Francis Ford Coppola, Steve, and we begin our 2 months of Coppola with this episode, my man.
I mean, we started with a month of Citizen Kane, and then we did, I think it ended up being a little bit more of a month of Hitchcock and Kurosawa. And we looked at, this month what we're doing is we're doing our usual just sort of biography of Francis Ford Coppola. That's what we're doing today.
Yeah.
And then we're going to move into The Godfather. We haven't recorded it yet.
No.
But it ain't going to be one part.
No.
It's not going to be short. And then we're going to move into the even bigger Godfather 2.
Yeah.
So that will be 2 parts at least.
Yeah.
And then we're going to be doing a commentary track of your choosing. So it's going to be up to the Cine-Files to decide what movie we do a commentary track. And we just put out our annual survey. And you can, if you haven't taken it yet, you can go to www.surveymonkey.com/ and here's the complicated part, /r/VQHXMX5. That's surveymonkey.com/r/VQHXMX5. And I'll put that in the show notes as well. And not only can you pick what Coppola film we're going to do a commentary track on, but you also can pick, because it's 2021, got a whole other year of movies we can explore, so you can choose which film from 2011 we're going to do first. And as we started last year, we're redoing some of our earliest Cine-Files episode in the new, more expansive format. And so you get to pick, do you want to hear us break down Die Hard again, or It's a Wonderful Life, or High Noon, or there's a whole bunch of good movies that we'd like to revisit, and we'd like to hear which ones you think we should do first.
Yep, these surveys are always great for giving us an idea of what's happening with our fans, giving us an idea of what they're interested in, because our fan base grows and grows every year, Steve. So the expansive point of view of the fans changes as well. So the survey gives us an idea of where their interests are going, what they're leaning towards hearing from us or wanting to hear from us. So it's exciting to see that as well. And a whole new batch of films from 2011 for them to choose from for us to cover. And there are some good ones in 2011 as well. So I'm excited.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the things we found out from listening to our fans is the number one thing that they've been wanting us to tackle pretty much since the beginning of the Cine-Files is The Godfather 1 and 2. And that's what we're going to start working on today with our exploration of Francis Ford Coppola. You know, it's funny.
Yep.
You and I are both Orson Welles obsessives.
Yes.
So we both knew a lot about him. I had read Kurosawa's biography and knew a fair amount of him. I had learned a lot about Hitchcock and read the Hitchcock Truffaut and some of those things. And so I feel like the first 3 directors we did this with, I was on pretty solid ground.
Yeah.
You know what? I've never read a biography of Francis Ford Coppola.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You know, so like this one, I feel like I know less than the others, and it was pretty interesting learning about him.
You know, what's funny is the less what you consider to be less is probably more than most people listening know about Coppola. So that's going to be exciting to go through as we talk about it. Yeah.
I don't know. Let's start just with a little bit of biography. He was born in 1939 in Detroit. His dad, of course, is Carmine Coppola, who was a flautist, a very successful flautist. They were in Detroit, and he was with the Detroit Symphony. His both his sets of grandparents came from Italy, of course. And what I didn't realize is that he has artists in his family. His grandfather's maternal grandfather is also a composer. And so there was a long tradition of, in both sides of his family, of a love of the arts. Here's what I didn't know. It's so obvious now that I know that he's from Detroit, is where he got the middle name Ford. It's Henry Ford.
Yeah, Henry Ford, of course. It's also why Tucker, A Man in His Dream, but was a personal one of the most personal films he's ever directed that didn't get quite the same notoriety as a lot of his other films, but there was a definite impulse and desire of his to showcase where he came from through that story.
See, I never connected it, and I just it's Francis Ford Coppola. That's just his name, and I just didn't think about that the importance. If you grew up in Detroit, I mean, that was a factory town in the 30s and 40s. You know?
I also think it's fascinating too, Steve, because that name Francis Ford Coppola, Coppola being the Italian heritage of that name, but Ford being the ultra-American part of that name. And a lot of his films are about that, especially certainly the Godfather series, about this idea of ingratiating yourself into the American way of things. And also, you know, what the American system, the truth and the lies behind the American system that are exposed within these characters in his movies as well. So that's also kind of an indirect thing to have as part of his legacy through his name.
That is a fantastic point. It never occurred to me. You're 100% right. That blend of the immigrant and American, and is the immigrant American, and what is America?
Right.
That's absolutely fundamental to so many of his films. His dad was also the assistant orchestra director for the Ford Sunday Evening Hour, which was from Detroit. And that's when he got discovered and hired by the NBC Symphony Orchestra as their flautist. And like, that's a big deal. I don't think we understand today what that meant to be a musician playing at the NBC Symphony Orchestra.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah, of course.
He was an important guy. And that's, of course, what moved them to New York City. He grew up in Woodside, Queens. And then I think the most important event in his young life is he had polio. And that meant, much like I think Martin Scorsese was very sick as a kid, and that meant he was home in bed a lot. And that gave him time to read. He read poetry. He did puppet shows. He let his creative mind expand when his physical body couldn't go out and do stuff.
You know, it's very reminiscent of Teddy Roosevelt as well. You know, Steve.
Great point.
Right? So many of our, for those of you parents, I know Steve and Karen are parents, but for them, I am not. But for the many people who are parents, you know, so one of the worst things that you initially encounter is a child having an illness that leaves them bedridden, or leaves them struggling, or leaves them suffering, or looking out the window, seeing other kids playing and being able to do it. But you can see some kind of silver lining here, that they have more time to study, to learn, to become intelligent. So once they survive or come out of this illness, they'll have a better understanding of the world, and possibly even a better chance to be successful in this world in whatever field they choose to pursue. I'm not saying I'm wishing that on people, but we're seeing numerous examples of people who've succeeded despite these illnesses, or took the time that they were bedridden to educate their mind so that they're more advanced than other people at a certain age. And certainly with Coppola, that hubris that was developed from his intelligence comes to the forefront in a lot of his situations as he grows up and becomes a filmmaker.
It's interesting what you say, and I was just thinking about, like, how many of your good qualities came from adversity, as opposed to how many good qualities came from the points of your life that were easy.
Yeah.
You know, all of my strengths came from adversity.
Of course.
I mean, maybe that's not true. Like, I mean, I think, you know, I had my parents were a very stable environment growing up. I think that helped me in a whole bunch of ways.
Yeah.
But it's overcoming adversity that defines you.
I think so too.
In lots of ways.
Yeah. Agreed.
I think one of the biggest influences that I can find of him in his early life, in addition to just being home with polio, was at 15 he read Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. And that's just, I mean, that moment in the theater and in arts in America is just so shattering. And you could totally see how that kind of raw, emotional, American, down-to-earth drama affected everything he was going to do.
Yeah.
He also, much like a whole bunch of people we've talked about, Steven Spielberg, Coen Brothers, Ken Burns, a whole bunch of other guys, he got that 8mm camera and he was making little movies. And at first, though, he wanted to be a musician like his dad. He played the tuba, and apparently he played it so well that he got a scholarship to his first of many high schools, which is the New York Military Academy. Can you picture Francis Ford Coppola at military school?
Playing the tuba. Yeah, no.
Play the two.
I mean, no, I can't. Not without a lot of battles, I'm sure. Verbal battles for sure.
You want to know my dad was in ROTC because it was required when he was at Cal.
Right.
You want to hear my dad's story of ROTC?
Please.
Who was way more of a conformist than Francis Ford Coppola. Let's be real clear. My dad was Eagle Scout, straight arrow, didn't drink, he never did drugs, anything like that. Apparently there was like a sergeant, in ROTC, and who didn't like my dad, and my dad had polished. You're in the Army, you know much more about this than me. My dad had polished his shoes, polished his belt, pressed his clothes, the whole thing. Went out for drill, and this sergeant walked up, kicked dirt on his shoes, and then looked down on his shoes and says, you didn't shine your shoes. And my dad, the straight arrow person, said, "That's because you just kicked dirt on them, you son of a bitch." That was the end of my dad in ROTC.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine Francis Ford Coppola.
Oh, right. Dealing with
military
that.
school.
Yeah.
Apparently he went to 23 high schools.
What?
That's what I read. I knew that he had bumped around a bunch, but what I read was 23 high schools.
Now, was it because of the military? Was he sorry, not the military, but the Carmine was moving her family around?
No.
Oh, wow.
Nope.
Wow.
I don't think so. And this is where I haven't read that Coppola biography, so maybe there's a whole bunch of details I don't know. But I think he didn't fit easily.
Yeah.
Ended up going to Hofstra. What I didn't know, one of the students he was at Hofstra with, James Caan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes, and he went on a theater scholarship for playwriting. So he stopped the tuba, and now he went on to playwriting because, again, Streetcar Named Desire, he wanted to go into the theater, and it's really then that he discovered film.
Yeah.
He wasn't like Scorsese, because it's a very similar story. He was sickly as a kid, but it was going to that movie theater was the most important thing in his life. It doesn't sound like that was true as much for Coppola, but and you want to know what the director? Well, there are two directors that are really the people that made him change his path to filmmaking. The first, which is really clear and obvious in his work, is Elia Kazan.
Yeah.
Who obviously directed Streetcar.
Yeah.
And has that raw American working class thing. I mean, that
immigrant
huge in Coppola.
Yeah, son of immigrants. Yeah, and exploring the underbelly of the American system, the American ideals. Yeah.
But the other one, and this is what I find fascinating, is Sergey Eisenstein. So that's Battleship Potemkin, that's Ivan the Terrible, and that's and the reason I bring this up that I find is so interesting is, to me, those are the two aspects of his filmmaking: the raw, emotional, truthful American immigrant personal stories, and the artsy fartsy guy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And when that balance is good, that's when Coppola's movies are great.
Yeah. True.
And then he went off to UCLA Film School in 1960 for grad school.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, that this is the first generation of directors coming out of film school. And Francis Ford Coppola, he's like the papa. He's like the older brother of all these other guys that are going to be our filmmakers of the 70s, Like Francis Ford Coppola was the first.
Yeah. And, no surprise again that he kind of assumed this kind of, like you said, Papa mantle with like Lucas and Spielberg and Scorsese. They're all contemporary, Hal Ashby, all contemporaries of this time that were coming out. He was seen as the Papa Bear. It was his natural energy, right? But also what you brought up earlier, you can't discount the fact that he probably exuded a more well-read nature, a person who is more knowledgeable of the human condition and of the multiple facts about the world that there might be, radiates that kind of Papa energy, wouldn't he? Like I wouldn't say calm, because he's certainly a very passionate guy, but certainly intelligence, knowledge, and so you radiate to that when you're a young man who can teach me things, and certainly Coppola probably radiated that with these guys 1,000%.
Well, he's just one of those people that you could see everyone gathered around, and when he spoke, I mean, George Lucas, he's not going to argue with Coppola in 1970.
Right.
You just go yes, whatever you say.
Yeah.
And that's what's so interesting that we'll get into in the later parts of his career, when really almost all these people surpass him.
Yeah.
In all sorts of ways, and what that has got to feel like.
Right.
Here's someone, I always forget this person was in film school at UCLA that was a student with him, Jim
Morrison. Yep, Jim Morrison. The Doors.
That's just crazy, like feeling these worlds collide like that.
Yeah. I think there's a clip in the movie with Oliver Stone where somebody who looks like Coppola makes a comment about his movie, and I think that might be a little bit of a sly allusion to that.
Oh, that's it. I haven't seen that movie since I probably watched it a few times after it came out.
Yeah.
But not in a long time. My guess is I don't really need to.
No.
I mean, Val's really good as Jim Morrison.
Yeah. Val's always good, pretty much in anything he's in.
So there's a point, and this seems like it's just a key moment in his life. He's broke. He's living on like $10 a week. And he finds out that some students are making a little bit of money shooting softcore pornography, making skin flicks. So he's like, well, I can do that. And he writes a short film called Peeper. He gets someone to give him $3,000 to make it. He hires a Playboy playmate named Marley Renfro. And they make this movie, and he couldn't sell it. No one wants it. And this is what's so crazy, this story. He finds another company that sells softcore pornography that has another movie starring Marley Renfro, and they can't sell that either. So they pay Coppola $500 to cut the two movies together and make one longer film, which he does, and they sell it.
Wow.
Yeah. And then that becomes his gig for a while. Like there's some German softcore movie that he gets, and he gets hired to, and he shoots some new footage and re-edits together and creates a new film, and then they release it. And so he's making money doing this while he's going to UCLA. And this is, of course, who discovers him at this moment is Roger Corman.
Roger Corman, of course.
Yeah. And Roger Corman, he is the seminal figure in a whole bunch of these, from Ron Howard and Martin Scorsese and James Cameron, and like they're all these people that came through the Corman world. And it's because he saw Coppola as someone he could use, and I mean use in the mostly good way.
Yeah, right.
Here's a talented person, they can do something for me. And so first he hires him as an editor, because that's what he's been doing. And because I guess Corman had bought some Russian sci-fi monster movie.
Yeah.
And so he handed it to Coppola and said, make something out of this. And he cuts it, and Corman goes, oh, well, this is interesting. So now he hires him to be like a dialogue director for a couple of movies, and then he's an associate producer. And I love Corman. Like, he's just such a fascinating figure. And they're shooting some movie in Ireland, and this is my understanding of the story. Corman realizes that he is going to come in under budget on this movie, and so he's going to have an extra $20,000. And so he goes to Coppola and says, can you come up with a movie that I can shoot for not much money tonight? Coppola goes home, stays up all night, writes a treatment, brings it in the next day. Corman goes, that sounds good, manages to get another European distributor to put up a second $20,000.
Wow.
He has $40,000, and that's where he makes his first film, which is, I think it's Dementia. I think that's what it's called. And that's also where he met his future wife, Eleanor, was working on this Corman film. And then he's still, of course, a student at UCLA, and he's getting some writing jobs. He writes script for This Property is Condemned, Paris is Burning. This is 1966. And then he buys the rights for a book called You're a Big Boy Now. And he kind of took it and with his own ideas came up with a script and then was going to produce it as his thesis film for UCLA. Wow. And that film, which is You're a Big Boy Now, gets distribution from Warner Brothers. So first of all, you make your student thesis film and it gets a theatrical distribution from the studio. Geraldine Page is in the movie.
Wow.
And she gets an Oscar nomination.
Wow.
So his student film, essentially, that he made for very little money, has distribution and is an Oscar-nominated film in 1966 or 67.
Right.
That's amazing.
It's incredible. And this is 5 years away from Godfather, by the way. So just insane to think about that he is already establishing a relationship with the Academy through his work.
It's stunning. Have you ever seen this one?
No,
by the way?
I have never seen this one. No.
I watched it maybe 10 plus years ago.
Okay.
It's what's interesting about it is it comes out I think the year before The Graduate, and it is very much in that a much less good version of that kind of movie.
Oh, okay.
If you look at it as a film, you I don't think it's that great a movie.
Right.
If you look at it as a first real film from a young filmmaker with no budget,
right,
it's really impressive.
Well, it's like Following, right? Nolan's first film. You watch that film, you're like, oh, okay, I see the bones of what you're going to be doing later. This idea with time, messing with perception, messing with double crosses, all of this you're going to be tackling in a number of films. So you see the groundwork. It's all black and white, and you're just like, okay, this, you can see what is going to be coming. So certainly I'm sure Coppola's film there displays that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next thing he's doing is directing Fred Astaire and Petula Clark in Finian's Rainbow.
Finian's Rainbow.
Which I've seen a long time ago.
Oh, man, yeah. Some people swear by it, though. Some people do like that movie. I put that in the Darby O'Gill kind of category, but both those films is kind of weirdly coming out around that time. Achieving a certain level of, I don't know if I would say legendary status, but certainly some level of status that they are films that people refer to in fascinating ways.
Well, this is the end of the studio system, as we talked about many times. It's now 67, 68.
Yeah.
And the studio is trying to make their old-fashioned kind of musicals, and they just don't hit. No. Like, it's just off at this point. This formula that worked so well for 20 years, it ain't working.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, particularly if you look at Dr. Dolittle, which comes out, I think, the same year or the year before.
Right.
That is a weird movie.
Well, we spoke about this before, too, in the past, Steve. This is right when Vietnam is starting to become a cultural touchstone, right before the riots in the Democrat at the Democratic National Convention in 68. The public does not want to go to the movie theater anymore to get lost in lies. What they want to go see is the exposure of these lies. You know, it's so a lot of these movies in the late 60s start to explore and investigate and eviscerate a lot of the political institutions and the systemic pillars of our society through the films.
Well, and I think that is what Coppola is one of those. He's at the forefront of this, you know, is because what he does next is he makes Rain People, which I've actually never seen.
That's
1969, and then he founds American Zoetrope, which is he rejects Hollywood. He says, us artsy people, we're gonna go up to San Francisco. We're gonna create our own world of filmmaking that won't owe anything to the Hollywood establishment. And if you listen to his mission statement, it's amazing. You know, it's like, we're gonna make more interesting, more creative films. We're gonna bring in young artists, allow people to express themselves, and it's gonna be this great, amazing, perfect filmmaking world, all created by Francis Ford Coppola. And it never actually really happens. You know, they do certainly make some films, but it's always, and it's so funny. I remember being involved in the founding of a theater company before I started film school back in the early 90s. And this could have been their mission statement. We're young playwrights and new artists and new voices, and we're gonna not have to deal with the Bay Area theater establishment. And it's really hard to do.
Well,
you know?
I mean, it's his declaration of principles, right?
Totally.
People are going to know who's responsible. They're going to get the truth in the Inquirer quickly and simply and entertainingly, and no special interests are going to be allowed to interfere with the truth. This is Citizen Kane quotes, "I will also provide them with a fighting and tireless champion of their rights as citizens and as human beings," signed Charles Foster Kane. So I imagine he's influenced by this idea, right? And once again, this is the late 60s. We're coming out of the flower of power times. We have this idea of people embracing idealism, embracing a different kind of America, trying to create a different kind of America that's very much a commune America, right? Everybody helping everybody to achieve a certain level of success. And who else but a Papa Bear type person would create this kind of thing? You know, it's almost like a pseudo cult, but for creatives.
And who is with them? Someone that he met on the set of Finian's Rainbow is George Lucas.
Yeah, Lucas.
And it really seems like Lucas was his Bernstein. You know what I mean? not even as Jed Leland, I don't think.
No, I don't
You know.
think Lucas. Maybe Spielberg had a little bit of the Leland in him, but certainly Lucas was more of the Bernstein. Like, totally bought this hook, line, and sinker. As he was growing in his own confidence as a filmmaker, this was a place where he could feel a connection to some kind of more powerful energy, more powerful essence. Maybe there is a little bit of the Emperor Palpatine driven or derived from Coppola. Who knows?
That's hilarious.
Yep.
That's really funny.
You never know.
Well, and what's so strange, because Lucas is up there with Coppola looking in Marin County, which is where I grew up, they wanted to find like the big house to go be the beginning of American Zoetrope. They couldn't find anything. They ended up starting in a warehouse in San Francisco. But then you look at what Lucas did later, which is Lucas Ranch.
Yep.
And that is so much, it is a version of what Coppola was trying to do, but it is not what Coppola was trying to do. And it's so, yeah, because it isn't for young artists to do their artsy creative stuff. That's not what's going on at Lucas Ranch.
No, Skywalker Ranch. Yeah.
Skywalker Ranch. I don't know where that came from.
Yeah, no worries.
Anyway, so and something that we've already talked about is in the mid-'60s, he was also hired to write Patton.
Yeah.
And if you want to hear more about that story, we did a 2-part big exploration of Patton a few months ago. But suffice it to say, that movie, which wins Best Picture, he won the Best Screenplay Oscar. That is 1970, and that's what puts Francis Ford Coppola on the map.
Yeah.
But he still didn't want to work in Hollywood. So he's still up in San Francisco, and then Robert Evans is trying to find someone to direct Godfather. And they offer him the part, and first he says no, and George Lucas says to Coppola, maybe you should take this job because we're out of money.
Yeah.
And we'll talk much more about The Godfather, of course, because we're going to be going in depth on it.
Yeah.
But suffice it to say, it was very successful.
And also what Lucas says to him in that moment is something that Coppola would be struggling with for the rest of his time as a filmmaker. The idea of American Zoetrope, the idea of them struggling to make money. It is very similar to Wells. There is a lot of similarities to Wells and Coppola and how they have this idealistic version of what they think should be happening in Hollywood. Their desire to rebel against the old system of Hollywood. Their ability to create or garner a level of people who are around them all the time, who support their visions, who are willing to sacrifice themselves to achieve the overall vision of what they're trying to do. So there are a lot of similarities here with Wells and Coppola.
100% agree. And I think there's so much interesting to say about this. So the first thing to me is I think there's an argument to be made that Coppola is the director of the 70s.
You can absolutely make that case. Yeah.
That his movies, 72 is The Godfather. 74 he makes The Conversation, which wins the Palme d'Or, which I think is an amazing movie.
It is a great movie.
And one I definitely would like to talk to. And that is on what he really says he wanted to do. I wanted to make personal, artistic, interesting, non-mainstream films. And that's The Conversation.
Right.
That's the best of those movies, in my opinion, of his. And in the same year, he makes Godfather 2.
Yeah.
Like those two movies from one director in the same year, there are very few. We talked about Spielberg doing both Jurassic Park and Schindler's List in the same year.
Yeah.
There's a few times where directors have done this, not very often.
Yeah.
And when this happened, he was nominated for Best Director for both movies.
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, how often does that happen? I think both movies were also nominated for Best Picture. And of course, Godfather 2 wins a ton of stuff, including Best Picture and Best Director and Screenplay. He and Billy Wilder are the only two directors to win 3 awards for one film.
Wow.
Because he won Best Picture, Director, and Screenplay on Godfather 2.
Yeah. Incredible. You know what's crazy, Steve? You would talk about this. You say he only directed 4 films in the 70s. That's insane. Godfather 2, The Conversation, and Apocalypse Now. That is a hell of a track record for a decade, right? Man. 4 iconic films in their own separate ways,
Well, and there's an argument to be made that he never did as well since.
Yes, absolutely. Like Wells.
Like Wells.
Yeah.
No, that's why I think that, by the way, I was looking some of the other people that had two films nominated for Best Picture are Victor Fleming, because he had Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz in the same year. Hitchcock had Foreign Correspondent and Rebecca in the same year. And then after Coppola, it's really interesting. So it's Herbert Ross, who had The Goodbye Girl and The Turning Point were both nominated in the same year.
Yeah.
And Soderbergh had Aaron Brockovich and Traffic both nominated the same year.
Wow. Okay.
Those are, I mean, it's so funny, like Herbert Ross is on this list.
Well, to be fair, no one talks about The Turning Point at all anymore.
No,
Yeah.
I totally like The Goodbye Girl.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the best of the Neil Simon movies. Richard Dreyfuss is great in it, but
Marsha Mason. Yeah.
but I don't put Herbert Ross up with Alfred Hitchcock and Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah.
1976, he starts shooting Apocalypse Now. We've obviously talked about this film. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
I think this movie wrecked him.
Absolutely. I mean, if you watch Hearts of Darkness, it is the tale of Icarus. It is him flying too close to the sun and burning his wings off. It is the ultimate sacrifice. He mortgages his house. Mr. Morris has some experience with that. He puts everything on the line for this movie, and everything possible that could go wrong goes wrong. Every sign there for any other person with a little bit less will to quit, to stop, to not go forward is presented to him. He is challenged on levels that he's never experienced before as a filmmaker, and he perseveres. He finds a way to persevere and create, in my opinion, the greatest war film ever made, but one of the greatest iconic films ever made in Apocalypse Now, about the experience of war, about the madness of war, about the lunacy of war, and at times about the unnecessariness of war, if that's a word. But he does it and perseveres. And so he was tackling, once again, Steve, a idea that has endured for centuries since humans were born. The idea of war and what it really takes out of you and what you experience when you give yourself over to it, and the damage it can do. And maybe there's even a symbolic connection for himself as a filmmaker. Making a film can be a war.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I've been trying to figure out how to articulate this, that there's a place where I think Coppola is at his best. And it is really at this weird nexus point of multiple things coming together. And one of them is he's at his best when he's battling. You know, Godfather, as we're going to talk about a lot, he was about to be fired throughout that film.
Oh, yeah.
Like, and that's where he does his best work, is, you know, making Godfather 2 in the conversation in the same year with a lot of chaos around him. Yeah. He does amazing work. And the ultimate example is Apocalypse Now, where he literally, his star has a heart attack in the middle of shooting. A hurricane destroys their set. They have no ending to the film. The lead actor shows up 30 pounds overweight. You know, they have, I mean, like the levels of insanity around him, somehow that fuels him. And the other nexus, I think, for him is there's this weird mix of poetry and artsiness with real heavy, serious stuff.
Yeah.
And it's funny because when we did Patton, the big reason they didn't like his script and threw it out was the opening monologue, all the stuff about reincarnation, all the sort of poetic stuff. And then when George C. Scott came on, that's what a lot of that got brought in.
Yeah.
And it's that mix of this gritty, realistic war film and this weird artsy stuff. And again, Apocalypse Now is the ultimate example.
The journey using Joseph Conrad's book, Hearts of Darkness, as and once again the Wells connection, because that was the first film that Wells was actually aiming to do before Citizen Kane, was Joseph Conrad's Hearts of Darkness. So to see Coppola take it, and maybe in some kind of hubris again, Steve, like tackling this this difficult story, this almost unfilmable story himself, and trying to walk in the shoes of someone great like Orson Welles and bring that vision to life. Maybe he was messing with the film gods, and so they messed with him back with all this drama and madness around him to create it. But yes, there are so many poetic moments throughout this film combined with the gritty, real effects and cost and consequences of war.
Well, and it's a descent into madness.
Yes.
And there's so many scenes where it's like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
I mean, it's real. It completely leaves the realm of reality. There's no, thing like Kurtz in the Vietnam War. That's not what that world was.
Right.
That is this created world of Coppola. And I really think, while he makes movies that I like after this, I don't think he ever reaches anywhere close to this level again.
I think you're absolutely right. This is the apex of him as a filmmaker. And Steve, that's what the sometimes ugly truth is about a lot of these filmmakers from the 70s. They never captured their greatest work again after the decade was over. And certainly with Coppola. And isn't the irony that Coppola's, throughout that whole movie, it's the Jim Morrison music, isn't it? It's the Doors. It's his fellow classmate there at UCLA, his music that he uses to showcase, the madness of Vietnam. When the end, the Doors song, "The End."
Yeah, which is so powerful.
Oh yeah, I love that.
Let's move into the 80s.
Okay, if we have to.
He makes One from the Heart, which is a musical. Which maybe I've seen. I don't know.
Yeah.
It was a financial disaster.
Yeah.
He makes Hammett, which he co-directed with Wim Wenders, which I have never seen.
Yeah.
Which was a financial disaster. Then he makes The Outsiders and Rumblefish. These are two good films, I think, based on the S.E. Hinton books. And first of all, we got to talk about these casts.
Yeah.
I mean, Outsiders has Matt Dillon, Ralph Macchio, C. Thomas Howell, Patrick Swayze, Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, Diane Lane, and Tom Cruise. It's a good movie. I haven't seen it in a while.
Yeah, it's definitely an 80s movie, but I think it's, and some people have a real nostalgic love for it. But I also think it's more a film that launches so many careers or captures certain people at a certain time when they're at their apex as in terms of fame. Leif Garrett being one of those people.
Oh, right.
And it has a very young Tom Waits in the cast of this, who will later show up in Bram Stoker's Dracula as Renfield. Right. So you're right. The casts are incredible for this. And I think Rumblefish is Matt Dillon as well. Am I not wrong on that? With
no, it's Matt Dillon.
Yeah, Rumblefish as well, with him and Mickey Rourke and Diane Lane coming back as well.
And Outsiders, it does okay. It had a $10 million budget and it made $25 million.
Right.
Which is okay. That is, I mean, compared to what he did in the 70s, where he had these huge, because that's the thing about all of them. Godfather, Conversation, Godfather 2, and Apocalypse Now. Conversation is the least successful financially, but they're all really successful. And they're all serious, heavy, artsy, long movies that make a lot of money. And that's the 70s, and now he's moved into the 80s, and this doesn't really work. Rumblefish was also $10 million movies. It made $2.5 million. He does The Cotton Club in 84, which is not a good movie.
That is a rough movie. Yeah.
Also just completely fails. It's a $48 million budget, which is really big in 84, and it made $26 million.
Yeah. I mean, Richard Gere,
he's getting killed.
He's getting killed, but he's getting these budgets based on what he had done in the 70s. But the 80s are a completely different time, isn't it? The 70s is about exploring the political systems and the lies and all of that, Watergate and all that. The 80s are the age of excess and Reagan and those kinds of things, and The Breakfast Club and John Hughes. And the last thing they want to see is these kinds of movies. Even De Palma figures out the 80s a little. You could argue De Palma is the Scorsese of the 80s in terms of the approach to the kinds of films. He grapples with that decade better than Coppola does.
Absolutely. I mean, Coppola just is flailing.
Yeah.
And then his buddy, who was his underling, has become hugely successful.
Right.
Lucas is made more money than Coppola could ever dream of. And he hires Coppola to make Captain EO, Which in a weird way, I might have seen more than any other Coppola film because I was at Disneyland and would go to see Captain EO because you're like, well, I don't want to get into the line for Space Mountain right now. I'm going to play a couple video games in the arcade, jump through Captain EO, and then I'll get in line for Space Mountain. So I probably watched it 30 times. Michael Jackson, some 3D.
Yeah, Angelica Houston, a very, very strange film to say the least. But just like Wells, right? Taking these jobs to stay alive, to make money. There are a number of things Wells did so he could fund the other stuff he was trying to do that you would look back on and be like, why would you ever do this movie? Why are you in this movie playing this character? But it's about the overall thing that he's trying to accomplish.
Yep. Then he has his first success since Apocalypse Now, and that is Peggy Sue Got Married.
Oh, man. Yeah.
It's fine.
It's fine. And Kathleen Turner is great. It's the emergence of a Nicolas Cage who is becoming a person to watch. And of course, Nicolas Cage was in Rumblefish as well. So he is becoming someone that Coppola looks to work with. And of course, he is related to Coppola, Nicolas Cage is as well. And we should mention that Talia Shire is his sister in real life. Jonathan Schwartzman, who is Talia Shire's son, is his nephew. So it's there's a lot of people around Coppola that are talented and become successful in the film as well. Nicolas Cage being one of them.
Well, and something we're going to talk about a ton, I'm sure, in Godfather is family.
Yeah.
Family is very, very important to Coppola. That is very much how he thinks.
Yeah.
His next film, which I have seen, is Gardens of Stone with James Caan.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember watching that movie because it was right when I was getting into films. Mm-hmm. And it was when I sort of went, oh, the great director can make a not great film, I really like Tucker, the Man in His Dream.
I do too. I think it's a sweet film. Jeff Bridges is so alive in this movie, man. It's not a character he gets to play much as Jeff Bridges, and he's so much fun in Tucker and Man in His Dream. And it's heartbreaking too, Steve. He finds a way to find the sentiment in this. And of course, this is also when Martin Landau starts to come into prominence again. His renaissance as an actor as well as through Tucker or the Man in His Dream.
Yeah, it's my favorite post-70s Coppola film.
Oh, okay.
I mean, honestly, as we said, the competition so far is not that tough. And certainly not with this next film, which is 1/3 of New York Stories and the worst third.
Yeah.
The Woody Allen movie is perfectly funny. The Martin Scorsese movie in there is really good with Nick Nolte.
I agree.
And this one starring or co-written with Sofia Coppola is terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think it's a version of her life, right? Is a kind of a story about her life. Yeah. And you're right. The Scorsese one is the one to watch of the New York Stories.
Then to Godfather 3. Have you seen the new
Coda? It's funny. As we're recording this, I ordered it yesterday on Amazon because it was sold out all over where I live. And the Best Buy and Target were sold out. I imagine people gave them as Christmas gifts. So I ordered it from Amazon. Should be getting here Sunday. And I will be watching it on Sunday for sure.
We've talked about, and it's on our survey too, about doing some more of these sort of hour-long discussions of movies that don't get the full cinephile treatment. I think The Godfather 3 will be I think we should do it for that.
1,000%.
And do Coda, do the new version. I'm curious to watch it.
Yeah.
I have not liked any of the recuts of Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
I still like the original first.
I agree.
So I don't have that much faith. And Godfather 3, there are scenes in it where you're like, this scene is amazing.
Oh, yeah. The scenes with Garcia and Pacino are so alive and so electric, and they're fun. Yeah. Even Talia Shire, I love what they did with Connie in the third one, what she has become now as an older woman, having gone through the stuff that she went to in the first two films. It is so great to see her embrace a little bit more power in the family. But Sophia is so horribly miscast, and it makes it so difficult to enjoy and watch the movie.
Yeah.
But there are shades of Coppola, and you wonder where this guy went through the 80s. Why wasn't he directing Untouchables? Why wasn't he directing these epic 80s films and bringing that kind of life? I mean, Last Emperor that Bertolucci did, how is he not creating these epics, these incredible films? Why is he doing Peggy Sue Got fucking Married or Tucker even? It's just like, these are films that are beneath him to a degree and his talent. Why is he not making these other films? Is it a combo of his own self-destructive impulses like Wells had? Is it because studios don't want to hand him epic films? They don't believe in him anymore? I don't know what it is. But seeing so many great scenes in Godfather Part 3 shows you that muscle, that ability is still there with the right material.
Here's what I think, and I have no evidence of this at all, and it's psychoanalyzing a person who I don't know, but I think he was scared.
Maybe after,
I think
like
Apocalypse Now scared him.
Yeah.
And I think he has to be in these, he threw himself into these battles, these just crazy situations, and did his best work. And I don't think he wanted to go there again. I think he wanted a gig. And Captain EO is a gig. Peggy Sue Got Married is a gig.
That's a gig, yeah.
You know, like, and he's a talented person and brought his talent to those things. But I don't think until you get to Godfather 3, I think there's some elements of like, okay, you know, it's time to bring it. Yeah. Bram Stoker's Dracula is extremely successful. I do not like that movie.
I think just like one lesser so than Godfather Part 3, I think there are some good scenes in the movie. I think
very cool.
I think Gary Oldman is incredible in that fucking film. And the opening of him when he becomes Dracula, that is so full of rage and passion and artistry. And once again, Steve, like you said, the combo of the poetry, because the visuals of that movie are stellar, combined with the grittiness of him being Dracula. I think that's where he kind of fails in the movie, is being able to combine those two as seamlessly as he did in previous films, because I think there was all the makings of one of the most epic Dracula films ever told.
Totally agree.
And he just didn't quite get there. He indulged one side or the other too much in certain scenes, and it ended up just not making the film totally work.
I've only seen it probably twice.
Oh, wow.
So maybe I should watch it again. But like what I can remember from watching it is like, oh my God, this is so cool.
Yeah.
And now I'm completely bored. Oh, this is really cool. I don't understand what's going on now.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's I'm just looking at what the next movie is.
Yeah.
Is Jack.
No, I've never
Robin
seen
Williams.
this. I've never seen this and may never see this, to be honest.
There's no reason you should. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's not a terrible movie.
Right.
It's just not a good movie. Rainmaker is okay.
I like Rainmaker
I like it
for what it is. It's a perfectly good film, serviceable film. Once again, he's using an author. He's adapting an author's work, like he did with Mario Puzo, like he did with S.E. Hinton, and like he does here with John Grisham. And I think of the Grisham adaptations, it's maybe the best or one of the best. Yeah. For sure. And Damon is great. Yeah.
Yeah. Then there's like a decade goes by. There's some lawsuits, some stuff that he didn't quite get made, and then there's I've never seen any of these movies.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any of the movies of his last decade. There's Youth Without Youth.
Yeah.
It's just supposed to be terrible. It had a $19 million budget and made $2.6 million.
Right.
There's Tetro, which I haven't seen.
Nope. Neither have I.
And then there's a movie which I had not even heard of, which is Twixt, which is Val Kilmer, Bruce Dern, and Elle Fanning, which it seems like it was barely released.
Yeah.
And that was in 2011. Here's what Coppola said in 2015. He said, "That's why I ended my career. I decided I didn't want to make what you would call factory movies anymore. I would rather just experiment with the form and see what I could do and make things that come out of my own mind." And little by little, the commercial film industry went into the superhero business, and everything was on such a scale. The budgets were so big because they wanted to make big series of films where they could make 2 or 3 parts. I felt I was no longer interested enough to put in the extraordinary effort film takes nowadays.
I think that's a cop-out.
Yeah, I do too.
Right? I think there have been many directors who have carved out. Let's look at Spielberg. I mean, I think this is a cop-out. Spielberg and Lucas. I mean, less so Lucas, but Spielberg certainly. Schindler's List is the 90s. That is 20 years after, or a little bit over 20 years after Jaws, or under 20 years after Jaws. He is still doing great films, iconic films that people will remember. It is that I think you might be right with your theory here. And of course, we're not saying it's 100% the truth, but maybe Apocalypse Now broke him in a way that he was never able to fully recover from. The idea that he was making studio films, that was his choice to do those studio films. That was his choice to do these kinds of things, because he lost it as he got older, Steve. We see this all the time. Friedkin made some of the best 70s films made crap after the 70s. You know, it's so many great directors from the 70s.
Bogdanovich. Same thing.
Oh yeah, Last Picture Show and what have you, going into the 80s, they don't understand how to navigate the decade of 80s, 90s, or 2000s, and they don't come back to prominence as directors. And it's sad to see.
Well, part of it, we have to say, is that directors like Scorsese or Spielberg, they're the exception. Like people who decade after decade can continue to produce interesting, really good work.
Right.
That's not normal. But I also think the reason I think it's a cop-out is it's not that I think that saying, hey, Hollywood has gone into these superhero films that have just, that's totally accurate. And saying, I don't want to do that kind of movie, that's totally fine. True. And saying, I don't want to be involved in the corporate world and all the networks and all the negotiations and all that stuff, totally fine. He didn't make that many good movies in the 80s.
Right.
You know, like Post-Apocalypse Now, you know, for after the decade of the 70s, for the first 5-6 years of the 80s, he could have done whatever he wanted.
Yeah, yeah.
He had an open door to do anything, and he didn't make good movies.
Right.
In general.
Right.
You know, and so like, that's why I go, it's a cop-out. Like when if he had made decades of good movies and then said, you know, I don't want to do this anymore, fine. But having a lot of failures on a lot of bad movies and going, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. It's like, well, okay. And this is the thing. I hadn't thought about the Wells comparison, but I'm so glad you brought it up because, you know, it's like we did Wells and then we did these two filmmakers that made great movies forever, Hitchcock and Kurosawa. And now we're back to another filmmaker who had the hubris and the ego and the passion and the charisma and shined unbelievably brightly for a small amount of time. Yeah. And it's still around.
Yeah. And, you know, and Steve, I would argue that Wells comes out on the better end of the deal than Coppola does, because Wells still made F for Fake. Wells still made these kinds of films that people talk about, still Chimes at Midnight, which is incredible because he stayed. He adhered or stayed a slave to his desire to make films his way that mattered, to pursue his artistic vision. And you could argue that a number of films could have broken Wells, the way they took the ending away from him for Magnificent Ambersons, the way they messed with him on Touch of Evil. There are a number of things that the studio system, that he willfully participated in this destruction of his own career at times, could have destroyed him. And he persevered, doing schlocky things as an actor, but it was also that he could direct his version of Othello or his version of Macbeth or do F for Fake or do these other films that were more of an expression of who he was artistically. So he did, and he talks about all the time in the later years how he became a slave to making these kinds of films because he just loved them and couldn't stop. Whereas Coppola, in a way, kind of sold out, which is the first time I'm really kind of considering that possibility, Steve, as we talk about it, that Coppola sold himself out. And you might be right. It might be out of fear. It might have been out because he just lost that spark to create these epic films. But certainly there's no way you could convince me that there wasn't a possibility. I'm sure De Palma, I'm sure Lucas, I'm sure all these people were like, dude, we will help you. Whatever it is, we will pave the way. Scorsese, Spielberg, I'm sure they all were like, whatever it is, we will help you make it.
George Lucas could have funded his films out of pocket change.
Absolutely.
You know, I'm really struggling with like how to articulate this because there's such odd people, Wells and Coppola.
Yeah.
I think surprisingly, you have this young egotistical Orson Welles that in some who was bossy and domineering and all the things that we know about him, but in some way he was the purer artist because I don't think Welles could stop.
No,
I don't think he was capable of not making a movie.
He died
even if
halfway through writing a script. Yeah.
Well, and he was just like, you know, and you look at what's the movie that finally came out?
The Other Side of the Wind. Yeah.
You look at The Other Side of the Wind, which isn't a good movie, but there are things in it where it's like, man, there's Orson Welles. Like some of the shots in it where you're like, holy shit, this is so gorgeous. And you could see, even if he's making it in his garage and carrying the camera and all by himself, he is not going to stop, until he died. Whereas Coppola, I think he had a vision of himself as Papa that he was in the 70s. And it was sort of, I'm still trying to be that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Throughout the rest of his films. Like maybe, I don't know if he could go hat in hand to George Lucas.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Steve. Maybe he couldn't give himself over to it and ask for help. And once again, Wells had no problem doing that. Wells swallowed his pride multiple times, asking for money. People offered him money. He, did commercials. He did voiceovers. He did, he's the fucking Transformers movie. He did things that funded him being able to do other things and had no shame about it. And whereas Coppola was very much a prideful man who didn't want to do these things and put himself in the position. So it's sad to see, actually.
Honestly, to go live in your winery in Napa, it's not so bad.
Yeah, agreed. Like, he eventually found his way to a money-making venture for himself that really worked out and traded in on his name, which speaks volumes about how much people still revere his name and his movies,
Well, and I got to go back to those 4 movies in the 70s. That's pretty unassailable.
Yeah.
On a resume.
Yeah.
Just like that back to back to make those films. There's no amount of praise I could give him that would live up to that, despite the fact that he also made a lot of movies where it's like, huh? He did what now?
And you wonder if he's got one more great one in him before he goes. You wonder.
Well, there's one called Megaopolis that is still on the books that he says he's still trying to make. Yeah. And it's something about a sort of post major attack and rebuilding New York City something, but that's all I know about it. I don't know if I would ask if you have final thoughts on Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah, I think we can, and it's great. I love these discussions, Steve, because I discover so much in thinking about it and in conversation with you about these subjects, and they're fun to explore. And you wonder if what we talked about is the truth about Coppola. This idea of there was so many movies inside of him, and he walked away from this impulse, from the desire to create the kind of films that he was creating in the 70s. Maybe he lost his confidence, maybe he lost his mojo, maybe he was scared, what have you. And you wonder about an artist's journey as they go through life, as they go through their career, multiple decades, and you wonder if they'll come back around to it once and for all. But that being said, for someone, Friedkin, Hal Ashby, Bogdanovich, you could throw all their great films from the 70s together and they won't match the kind of reverence people have for the Godfather series or for the Conversation in a Lot of Quiet Corners and for Apocalypse Now. They're not celebrating a 4K re-release of The Exorcist or The Last Picture Show. They did that last year for Apocalypse Now. They showed it in theaters, the 4K restoration, for a couple of weeks. And that shows you the kind of love people still have for Coppola. So although those 4 films are really his apex overall as a director, they are 4 films that people still rediscover, generations still rediscover and fall in love and still influence people to become filmmakers. So in that way, his legacy will always be assured and safe in the world of film. And people will forget the 80s and 90s and 2000s films because they don't matter as much as the 70s ones do.
Yeah, no, of course. It's funny just thinking about the other directors we've discussed in this manner, and Hitchcock being the ultimate example, along with Kubrick, of the directors where we perceive that they had the whole movie in their head and that they were just executing. And Hitchcock, where everything is so minutely planned out, or Steven Spielberg, where everything is really, really planned out and pre-visualized and thought through. And that is not Coppola, and that I think what Coppola did, which is a perfectly valid method of art, is I'm going to put myself in the situation and that things are going to happen and things are going to come to me and I'm going to discover things and actors are going to make choices and locations. Like Coppola always wanted to be in weather. Yeah. That's one of his, like Hitchcock wanted to be in the studio where everything was controlled. And Coppola was like, oh, it's snowing. Let's go shoot. Right. That's how he thought, because he felt that real things in the world would drive him to create, and certainly in the 70s, that was 100% true. Mm-hmm. I'm going to throw myself into a crazy situation and I will expect myself to be brilliant, which he was. And the problem with that system, unlike Hitchcock's, is how many times can you go to the well?
Mm-hmm.
And what if you're out in the situation and nothing comes to you,
Yeah.
you know, because sometimes it doesn't. And so I think like he is this, much like the 70s, this moment in time that never gets reproduced.
Mm-hmm.
There's no decade like the 70s in the history of film because there was so much experimentation. There was so much drive. All topics were wide open. Suddenly we, you know, violence and sex and drugs and real human emotion and the dark sides of people and all that was just getting explored. And that's Coppola, man. That's where he was. He was out in that.
Yeah.
And I think when the decade ended with Apocalypse Now is easily, you know, there are a couple of films you can say that's it. That's the end of the 70s. And Apocalypse Now, along with like Raging Bull and a few others, that's the end. Yeah. Once that era is over, he's never the same again.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. 1,000%. And, but still, his name still carries weight. And so, yeah, that's the thing at the end of the day is he's still one of the greats. No matter what, he's still one of the greats.
And the next, whatever it is, 2 months that you and I get to spend in his world.
Yeah.
I'm really excited.
Me too, man. There's going to be so much to talk about, so much to explore. And we get to relive one of the great artists when he is vibing with all his impulses and all his energies and all his decisions and all his battles. And maybe we explore by the end of that decade how much these battles, as we've said over and over again on this particular episode, took out of him. And that eventually he was all fought out by the time the 80s start.
You know, it'd be interesting, and I don't know that we'll do this, but when we get to the end, and we're at the end of Godfather 2 or wherever we are, it'd be interesting to revisit this question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who is Francis Ford Coppola?
That's a great point.
You know, because by then we will have really explored him, you know, a whole bunch. And maybe our thoughts will have evolved. I don't know.
Yeah. We're always open to that.
But right now, that's what we think of Francis Ford Coppola. We would love to hear what you think. What are his favorite films other than the ones that we're talking about? You know, maybe you're a huge fan of Rumblefish or Jack or The Rainmaker or Bram Stoker. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Visit our Facebook page. Just do a search for the Cine-Files. You can subscribe to the show, which I hope you already have on iTunes or Spotify. Visit us on YouTube where you can subscribe to the show and also leave your comments, which we love to see. You can buy or stream any film we've ever reviewed on cinephiles.net. You can support the show on patreon.com/thecine-files where you can hear our shorts. And you can, what is the next thing I'm supposed to say? Oh yeah. And you can follow the Cine-Files on Twitter at Cine_Files, on Instagram on the Cine-Files podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at SRMorris, SRMorris1 on Instagram. John, how about you?
You can always follow me at The Roca Says on Twitter and on Instagram as well. And if you wouldn't mind, come on over to my YouTube channel as well, youtube.com/John Roca Says. See all the multiple content that we're doing there, all the different wide variety of subjects we explore there on the YouTube channel.
And that is it for this week. But stay tuned for the not month of Coppola, but the months of Coppola coming soon to the Cine-Files.